Hello, Culture Matters podcast. I'm excited about our episode today. We're bringing back someone very special to talk about this amazing book. Before I introduce you to our guest, here's a quote just for this podcast, page 151. Life is a racetrack. Whether we like it or not, we can sit on the sidelines or bring our car into the pit for repair, but we must go back out and race. I want to dedicate this chapter that might otherwise seem dark to learning about pain and some deep dive tips on self sustaining methods for betterment and moving out of pain. If you are reading this book right now and suffering, you are not alone. I am here right now with you. Chapter 18, The Pain Point, Finding Honor, The Journey to the Truth. Christine Beckwith is back. Another round. God, I hope you, all the listeners, are following this. This is a lot of fun for me to read this book again. Every freaking page is highlighted, circled. Christine, thanks for coming back on the show. I'm drinking my coffee. I'm prepared.
I am ready, dude. I just got done working out and I've caffeinated and I'm ready to rock. And this is a powerful chapter. And for people that have never experienced, the depths of depression or clinical depression, um, it may not resonate, but I know, for those that are having to navigate that, and so many people are, it's life changing. And writing this chapter for me was really good at looking back at the times that I fell into those places and literally felt like I couldn't figure out the way out. And so this chapter really unpacks that, sitting with it, facing it, and kind of moving forward. It's funny that we're going over this chapter this morning. I have a client who is working on some trauma. Um, I mainly do consulting in the financial forensic executive areas, but I do behavioral management in depression areas. I'm not a doctor. Using my life experiences and probably transferred, 20 years of my own therapy through lessons forward. And I make sure I tell people, that I'm not a doctor and they should seek their own doctor out. But, these techniques have proven again and again to really be a game changer. And so it's really exciting to see people have breakthroughs. I sent a quote to a lady this morning that's really suffering right now, who I'm working with. And it says, don't deny what you feel. To do so won't make it go away, but only buries it. And buried things sometimes make us react without thinking. Acknowledge it, dig down to the roots in order to understand it. That's where the power is. You can feel things deeply and still keep your shit together. And
Mm.
so essentially, in a professional personal development manner, I included this chapter for the purposes of addressing that within our own industry and the world. I mean, any industry, the, you know, effects of your business, the results that you get are often deterred by what life is throwing at you behind the scenes. And so it's so important for the well-bodied, well-minded individual to keep that race car on the tracks, as you say.
Page 154, you're in Denver, Colorado, the first of 14 major markets to fall. I
Yep.
trekked my pregnant self to their district, stood before 125 people, and laid them off.
Yep.
How did you feel in that moment, and what got you through it as a leader? I want to kind of turn the tables on the leader's perspective for a
Yeah.
second. For those that have maybe been on the other side of that and been that person laid off. So,
Yeah.
yeah, what were you thinking? How did you get through it? What would be your advice to those in
Yeah.
the position?
I mean, it was the beginning of the downfall of the mortgage crisis. You're talking about '06, late '06, early '07 era. I was a newly appointed regional vice president, but my senior vice president had been terminated and I was an acting SVP at this time. Interestingly, I was co-partnering with another regional vice president. There was only two of us, and the whole nation was split. There was about 1,200 loan originators, 200 branches. Um, and we had been brought in, and there was a new CEO. Our CEO had been promoted over to the option one side from H&R Block Mortgage. And he was from California. We were meeting him for the first time. I remember being in Irvine, California, which is where our corporate headquarters were. And it was really my first like executive boardroom meeting. And again, at that time, the other partner VP was there. And we were both figuring out the way forward. Interestingly, the man I reported to, the man that was my partner, and the CEO all changed at once over the next like 90 days. Like nobody saw it coming for various reasons, by the way, that I won't go into. And I ended up in the hot seat at the head of sales. Um, and I was pregnant. I had just found out I was pregnant, under 3 months. And I'm getting my first orders to consolidate the company. We knew that the stakes were high because H&R Block is a publicly traded company on Wall Street. The mortgage division was very small, probably about 2,500 employees out of a whopping 14,000 of international employees working for the main firm for the tax division, and we had a finance sector. And we knew that at the end of the day, if we lost money, it could change shareholder price. So the stakes were high. And the task was, how do you get small enough to keep us in the black? You know, we're the biggest accounting firm in the world. We've got to get it right. We've got to lead. If we don't know as accountants, it actually, it will make, investors question our whole existence. And so no pressure, right? That
Mm.
day, the new CEO stood up. He had a whiteboard. I distinctly remember there was about five of us in the boardroom. And he said, this is what we are. This is what we're making. We are in the black, but we're headed for the red. We got to avoid the red. How do we get expenses down by this much? And we went to a lunch break. And I just remember sitting there so excited that I was a newly appointed, executive. I had found out I was pregnant after my round of interviews and getting selected out of 8 people. And I was really worried going to this meeting. And I wasn't prepared to tell them I was pregnant because I thought that they would regret their choice. I was the only woman that applied out of 8 and won that seat. So, I felt guilty about it. I remember being really torn and struggling. And I left that meeting. I went down to my rental car and I sat in the car and cried. And I'm sure that my hormones were raging at this point in my body. And so I had like, an altered condition and I just didn't want anyone to see me. And when I tell you I was crying, I was like full blown, like crying because I thought, man, I'd spent 10 years building the company. Everything I did was build, build, build. This was the anti thing. Like it's horrible to get the order to now start to tear something down. And as luck would have it, my partner was walking through the parking lot and saw me in the car crying. Walked up and knocked on the window, and I had to like, open the window, and he's like, "Are you all right?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I'm fine." I didn't want to let them see me sweat. And he was kind of an interesting partner, and I know people would figure this out just by my description, but very competitive. I competed with him at the lower levels. I had unseated him. He had been the #1 district manager for several years, winning like the annual Circle of Excellence contest. And he had kind of given me a hard time when I was newly appointed. And I was the first woman district manager that broke H&R Block's glass ceiling. They had never had a woman at that level of senior leadership before. And those things I wasn't questing because I was a woman to be in those positions. But what was happening as it was happening is articles were being written from New York City about my appointment. And so I had like this huge spotlight on me, like, oh, they'd never had a woman, here before. And I took over a last place district. Anyways, he razzed me a lot. My first few district meetings were really difficult because of him. Instead of being warmly welcomed, he would kind of locker room banter with the guys about me taking over, like what, you got the worst district, you can't go anywhere but up. They threw you a dud to see what you can do, type of
Mm.
thing. And anyways, long story short, within 16 months, I rose to number one district in the country. I unseated him. I won 3 more years of Circle of Excellence, placing him in number two. And so there was competition between us, and he would always be, sportsman-like publicly, but I heard rumors of how he felt about it. And so he took his jabs at me. So having him see me crying wasn't great, because he literally went back in and told my boss, not the CEO, but the executive vice president of sales, that I had been crying in my car. And so I got pulled out of the meeting in the afternoon, and addressed, as to why. And I literally was lectured about emotion, and that there's no crying in baseball, type of lecture. And it didn't make me feel great. And I was embarrassed. Nonetheless, I had 3 days to decide how to consolidate. As luck would have it, my partner that did that would be fired in the next 6 months for something he had done, that I'll leave unmentioned, in the company, that was unforgivable on their part and had nothing to do with me, by the way. And so suddenly I had the whole country. And so making the decision of which districts would go first was hard. Denver was a market that was mediocre. They had half of their 125 LOs were brand new when I was sent to lay them off. By the time I got to them, I was like 7 months pregnant. And it was known. And, I traveled 34 weeks of my 40-week pregnancy by airplane to the various districts and branches. So I just was on a plane every week, and it got harder and harder. I was really big. I gained almost 60 pounds in my pregnancy. It's crazy. And had a 6 pound baby. So I was like, where the hell is the other 55 pounds? But nonetheless, I was in the hotel room the night before the being there. I had to be there in secret. Nobody knew I was coming, because you don't tell people in advance you're coming to lay off a whole district. I'd wake up the next morning. I remember just like my legs were swollen and I was exhausted. I cried again in my room that night, because I'd been hauling my suitcase through the airport, and it was hard, and my feet hurt, and just all the things that come with pregnancy at that level. And I again trying to hold up to this newly appointed position. And um I called them that morning. I let the district manager know first that I would be coming in, and that he needed to assemble everybody. And back then, everybody was brick and mortar. So those 125 LOs came to work every day in cubicles on that floor. And so it wasn't like if you called an impromptu meeting, it would be hard to get everybody together, because they were all there every day. Mostly, maybe onesies, twosies out sick or something. And I just said, we need a meeting at 11 o'clock. And he's like, what's this about? And I was like, unfortunately, it's, we're going to close your branch. I write in the book that I delivered the news as best that I could. There was a guy in the audience who had just been hired. He was 2 weeks in. And when we got to the Q&A, he said, I had so many choices of jobs. And he said it very, very, way angrier than I'm saying it. I'm just paraphrasing what he said. And he just said, how do you live with yourself? He said, I have a 2-week-old new baby at home. And um, I chose here. Like, how can one hand not know what the other hand is doing, and allow me to get hired, orientated, and be standing here and probably lost these other jobs? And I have mouths to feed. It was a fair question. It was an understandable angst. Um, I had people that spoke up before I could even answer in the audience, that knew me for a really long time, and ran to my defense, which was noble. And I just said I understood. I just said I understood how that person felt. So yeah, I mean, doing tough things, painful things throughout my career. I would go on to close another district, and then another district. And when we reached 3 districts and there were 14, we started to bleed because of the implosion. The volume just dropped out. If you remember right, in that market, equity in homes because a low demand had fallen and houses were upside down all across America. And it created a traffic jam of inability to refi, inability to buy, inability to sell. It was an unprecedented market. Um, Foreclosure rose to the highest historical level. It's never been that high since. Um, people were sitting in foreclosed homes for 2 years without payment being collected or them being ejected from their homes because there were so little people staffing wise to handle the foreclosures. It was loan moderations would, come up then, short sale regulation would be developed. It was a slow resolve and it would take 10 years for the market to recover. In the end, I had to close the whole company, carried a beeper for 6 months, um, beeper. Um, and and that was it. By September of '07, the company was completely closed. We closed in the black. We were one of the few companies in America that historically made it out of the mess ahead of losses. We did spare shareholder price. And even though it was a super painful, hard time for me, I would say it rendered some of the greatest leadership lessons because leadership is not just glory. It's not just inspiration. It's not just building. Sometimes it's consolidating, sometimes it's tearing down, sometimes it's saying the hard stuff and sitting with the hard stuff.
What were some of those lessons?
I think for me, I was in the first shocking place in my life, whereas I I did not have a relationship with the hard stuff that my job would require. I was a builder, I was a promoter. Um, and I felt sorry for myself. And of course, the pregnancy was hard. Jagger would come in February of, February 26th. And within a few short months, the whole company was closed. And so, my relationship to what leadership looked like changed, what good leadership looks like. I would spend 6 months traveling around the country. I had to go right back to work. I took an 8-week leave. Most women take 12 weeks because that's what you're allowed. And on my day that I went back, I got on an airplane. And he was kind of underweight. He was breech, so that's why he was so small. And leaving him at the airport, he was in preemie clothes instead of infant clothes for a while. Because babies lose weight when they're first born, they don't gain weight. The first month they lose weight. And so he went into a kind of preemie status. And I never thought I would have a hard time, just letting Jason Jagger's dad, be the one that would help me. He's an engineer, but we made a decision for him to stay home with Jagger at the last minute too. We were like 2 weeks away from putting him into daycare, infant daycare, and we did the walkthrough and we both got back in the car and we were like, yeah, no, I don't think I can leave him here. And the decision had been made, and I was grateful for that. But when I went back and I got on that airplane, I can remember it like it was yesterday sitting in my seat. I mean, I cried so hard, like everybody around me must have, again, hormones still raging at that point, no doubt. And it was like tearing my heart out of my chest. And to go do the work that I needed to do, just to give context, because I think, we go to work every single day, and this is what this chapter is about. We don't know what people have going on at home. We don't know what people have to carry or cover up. There's an expectation from the professional world. In the book, there's another chapter called Finding the Door, and I unpack clinical depression and I talk about different points in my life. I now, don't mind admitting that in my lifetime, I've been treated for that seriously a few times. It obviously, when you're young and these things happen to you, you question, like, am I normal? Like, what's wrong with me? And I've come to realize, and I share that in this book, that I'm a high feeler. And so there's other words that are stigmatic that we could paint this with, and I choose not to use them because I don't feel like people can hear me if I do. I think the minute that I say, the words that other people use that are stigmatic to paint labels on my condition, you're not going to hear or feel what I'm saying. I'm a high feeler. What does that mean? It means that my threshold of happiness and elation and my threshold of hurt and pain have no ceiling or floor. And so when life doles me something that's exciting, I'm kind of like crazy happy. And when someone, something happens that delivers pain, I spiral. And my mom had a brain aneurysm, and that year, right after I closed the company, while I was wearing the beeper on May 7th, I received a phone call. I was at home at that point, and I would have never been home. I had been working my whole adult life, but not working from home. And it allowed me to go drive the 89 miles that morning. She was life flighted. She had the brain aneurysm at work, not to go down a rabbit hole, but a million things went right for her that day, even though she had a really bad brain bleed. She was able to articulate before she became unconscious that her head hurt. She felt like her words were, I feel like I have an axe in my head. That allowed the ambulance to call ahead to the hospital, which rushed her into brain scan, which put her on a helicopter that arrived at a neurosurgeon hospital within 16 minutes of her arriving at the original hospital. And then she would be put into 14 hours of life-saving brain surgery. She was in an induced coma for 54 days. She had 6 more brain surgeries because when they open the head and they remove all the blood, they can't vacuum the blood out, but they have to they do a tube and they have to let it dissipate. Anyways, the brain starts to compulse around 10 to 14 days because the blood cells will vibrate and the brain reacts to it as a stimuli and squeezes, which is essentially a stroke. And when a person's having a stroke, there's so many damaging effects like paralysis and brain damage. So they had her hooked up so they could get early detection. And she would have 6 more 6-hour brain surgeries going up through her groin into her brain to put relaxation medicine on her brain so it would relax. And it was touch and go. I lost over 25 pounds over that 60 days sleeping on the waiting room floor. Um, and so it was a year. I'd had a baby. I closed a company. My mother had had a brain aneurysm. So I'm not too hard on myself about why I became depressed that year.
Here's the in the chapter, there's some powerful advice. You say, recognize the pain, compartmentalize, use the energy for positive things. This is the question I have. In that transition period, a new partner comes to mind in an acquisition of your next business that you're working with. This
Yes.
new partner has a vision for dominating this very uncertain time because things are very down. We're not at zero, we're at negative 100.
Yes.
So coming off of all that pain, if I'm following your thesis properly, if I'm the listener, recognize the pain, compartmentalize, use the energy for positive things. So my question is, do you think that you used the pain in that rebound? And
Yeah.
can you explain that story and that
Yeah.
trajectory?
Yeah, while this was all happening in the early months of that year, as I knew the company was falling, I obviously turned my eyesight towards what now, And I had 125 people sitting on my physical location floor, sales guys that were all coming into my office going, "Where are you going? What are we doing?" When they got the news in the unwind. And I didn't know at first. And I was in the Boston market. And that's where I had spent most of my career personally, even though I was a national manager the prior decade. And so, I found a job in a boutique shop in Waltham, Massachusetts called Lentegra. It was owned locally by a man that lived there, and he had about 25 loan officers. And I would end up bringing another 25 with me from that group, the best of the best in that location. And I accepted a position in April for a September start. My mom's thing happened in that window and she would go home in late June. And so July and August became just like an unwind time. I had tremendous joy occurring in the compartmentalization. I say, and I don't know whether I say it in this chapter, but I do say it in the book. Pain for me is a therapist gave this to me and they said, you can wear pain like a pair of shoes. Like you can sit in it, you have to face it. Obviously, in this book, I talk about walking my sister to her ultimate demise as well. My sister obviously, died from injuries of an attempted suicide. And, walking her out of her life, being in the doctor's office where they gave her 90 days to live, even though she lived several years beyond that. I had to live with that every day. I had to see her, I had to face it. And when I learned that I could drive home and, I'd leave, I didn't want to cry in front of her because I wanted her to be strong, but I'd get in the car almost every time. There's a theme here about me crying, by the way. How many times have we said cry? We should have made this a drinking game. But I, I cried in the car. And then when I would get here and it was time to run 2020, I would literally think about it that way. And physically, I would, just say, this paint's going to go on the shelf like a pair of shoes. And I'm not throwing it away. I'm not ignoring it. I'm not stuffing it. I'm just setting it down. And I'm going to focus right now on work. And I gained tremendous joy, from the work all of my life. I didn't know these techniques, by the way. Two prior episodes of clinical depression, 28 and 38. I spiraled so bad, I ended up in the hospital in both of those situations. And what would happen, clinical depression is not your average depression. Depression can be like, okay, I feel more tired, I'm sleeping longer, I'm not doing as much socially, you become a little more introverted. Obviously, you may be having negative thoughts and feeling sad and not experiencing much joy. Clinical depression is a serious illness in which your brain stops producing um, the chemicals that give you joy and happiness, like serotonin and dopamine. And when you reach that level, because you just your body is spiraling into it, it takes hold. And you don't recognize the depression anymore when you get into clinical depression. You aren't eating. A lot of people aren't eating. You're not sleeping well. You may be struggling. I don't mind sharing, and I've said in the book, when I got to the first time I got to the worst clinical depression at 28, I was a lone originator. And I struggled to bathe myself, like getting myself into the shower. It would take me an hour to talk myself into the energy needed to do it. And then I would lay on the floor of the shower because of how much energy it took. And often I didn't have the energy to towel myself dry. I would have to put a robe on over my wet body and lay and dry. I mean, it's serious. And I had somebody that recognized that I was clinically depressed who was a trained counselor. He happened to be a halfway house resident, recovered alcoholic that had owned a halfway house, but was also a branch manager at the company I was at. And when I didn't show up for work for a couple of weeks, he came knocking at my door and he refused to leave until I came to the door. And I've written in this, I believe in the Finding the Door, that it took everything I had to go to the door and open the door, and many, many minutes of debating whether to do it or not. And I would go to the hospital that day with his help. And I was in the hospital for almost 30 days, and where they would reteach me the techniques that I'm sharing in this chapter, which is, and I would start to eat slowly, and I would start to move and have activity and do therapy and walk my way back out. And so it sounds crazy because I think I'm a very smart, intelligent person. Um, that would happen again at 38, but I can tell you I recognized it because of the 28-year-old one. And now I've prevented it most of my life. Like I think I've said this. I was the one to find my sister when she died because we were so closely connected. I had moved up here to be near her, and we talked several times a day on the phone and texted throughout the day. And when she went radio silent, within 3 or 4 hours, I raced to her side. I had actually been racing to her side for a month. She would go quiet. And I can't tell you how many times I made that drive, which is only like a 3.5 mile drive between my house and the hospital. But just in a complete panic, not knowing what I was going to find. And it happened 3 or 4 times, and she would just be like sleeping in her bed, curled up, but was so sick and so little. When she died, she was 114 pounds. And I just, when I ultimately found her, I had this revelation literally the night, in performing CPR on her with my dad on the floor with me. And I knew in that moment, like, this was it. Like, I was going to need to save myself. Like, the minute I accepted where I was, I thought, I'm going to be in a fight for my life right now. Like, this is going to be one of those intersections. And I will say this, knowing what I'm capable, the levels of depression I'm capable of sinking to. And so I went right to work. I was in a therapy session within 48 hours of her dying. I was with my physician within 7 days. I was fully aware of my daily activities, and everyone around me was aware of the things that they needed to do to help me keep moving. And I kept moving. And at times it was unbelievably excruciating to work. But I did it, and I walked myself out of what I think would have been the greatest demise for me. And I'm still walking out of it. I still have moments, but work has been incredibly wonderful to set the shoes on the shelf. And I still pick the shoes up, less and less so. It's funny, I'll end by saying, people have a relationship with pain and grief. If your pain comes from grief of loss of a relationship or loss of a loved one, you have guilt over letting the pain go because it's the closest thing that connects you to the last thing that you have with that person. Like, it's the last act that you have. And in many ways, your grief is an honoring of the love that you had for them, and letting that pain go can feel like you're letting them go, and you feel guilty over it. And it's not uncommon. I mean, this is not me saying it. This is true about grief. And letting my sister's grief go, where I didn't dwell every single day, felt like I was letting her go. It's the saddest thing. It's the hardest thing. And so you have to tell yourself you're not letting her go. She's always there. And as I sit here today recording this podcast, her birthday's on Monday, 2 days from now, and it'll be her second birthday that she's missed. Tomorrow we're doing a memorial ride on the boat. We're releasing a wreath into the waters where some of her ashes were laid. And it's always an emotional time. And so this week's been, I've worked great. I had amazing things happen at work this week with all my companies. And I've experienced extreme joy this week with so many different places in my life and things. And at the same time, I'm going to turn and take those shoes off the shelf, and I'm going to put the pain point shoes on, and I'm going to allow myself to feel, because that's part of the healthy part of this. You cannot avoid, avoidance is not it'll stay inside you, and it'll come up in the ugliest of ways. And so,
I want to note that our audience may not be aware. Jack Nicholson, Mel Gibson, Abraham Lincoln, Winston Churchill, John F. Kennedy, Sylvia Plath, Robert Lowell, all game changers, world builders, who had, uh, the literature is pretty substantial, low lows, as well as, and this is where I want to transition in closing, high highs. And the list of the high highs: John D. Ventnor, who invented, I believe, DNA or the genome or something; Alexander Hamilton, who wrote 55 of the Federalist Papers, who was Washington's right hand; Andrew Carnegie; some may argue Alexander the Great; Nietzsche, and Bill Clinton. There's a whole book by John D. Gartner called In Search of Clinton, his high highs. So on the high highs, when Integra is acquired by Animac, what type of energy output,
yes.
action, get shit done was on the other swing of that pendulum that our audience can learn from
Yeah.
in those
And I'm
years
sorry.
following the Great Recession?
Yes, and I'm sorry because that was your original question and I went in 9 directions.
Well, but I think that
Yeah,
was
like
important to go
it
to
is.
outline,
And
because everyone that's listening is going to feel down and get
yeah,
knocked down get the wind knocked out of them. And I think you're and everyone I just listed are those admirable examples of those
Yes.
that have had the lowest of lows. And anyone could re-listen to that list and look them up.
Yeah.
Went through all of them, and the highest of highs to change the world. So go ahead.
Yeah. No, so on the other side of that horrible year I just described, then I got a job with that local Waltham office. I wasn't there 60 days. My phone rang from Wall Street. A young mortgage-backed securities bondsman who had started a small mortgage company in Mount Laurel, New Jersey, who knew nothing, not nothing, but who was not mortgage experienced, who was starting to collect leaders to build a dream company of being a national lender, had known of me through their president, Ryan Kuby. So the guy's Joe Pinabianco. And Ryan says, hey, I worked with Christine for 7 years. I promoted her to district manager. She's one of the best in the business. And I think we should, see if we can go get her. And Ryan would call me and broker a dinner with Joe, and they would fly in and we'd go out to Boston and have dinner. And they were like, we'd love for you to come and work for us. We'd love for this group to be with us. And that was kind of an impossibility. I just signed a 2-year contract, took a guarantee bonus up front for the contract, and it was legal. And I explained that at that dinner, but I was really interested in what they had because I knew where I was just a safe haven to outsit the mortgage implosion and, kind of like the life raft. We were kind of sitting in a life raft. And this opportunity was like, let's build a Carnival Cruise Line, and I'm like, yeah, let's do it. There were 6,000 out of work executives at this point in September of that year. And some of the statistics I remember, and of the 6,000, only 1% were women. And
Mm.
so getting a job in the regrowth, I knew was going to be hard. And so I grappled with the idea that, would I get some existing bank's executive job one day? I had been promoted up through the ranks with Block, and I thought getting into a place where I could build into a national platform would also give me the seat that I was looking for. And so we ended up figuring out the loophole would be if they bought the company, which was not for sale, they would acquire me and all the assets, human capital, they call it, within the roof of that. And so Joe tasked me with trying to, grease the wheels with the owner to sell. And over the next 90 days, we not only talked the owner into selling, but Joe would step up and buy the entire company. And I would then be seated as the vice president of sales. And we would go on for the next 12 years to build 72 branches nationally, and all the way up to like $5.5 billion a year company. And they far surpassed that, at the height of my career. And for the prior time, maybe 5 years, I dreamed of, going into full-time education and consulting for the industry. I just saw an area of opportunity and I knew I was good at it. And I knew I was good at building things. And I knew I was good at running companies. And I learned all the facets, not once, but twice now, between Block and Annie Mac. And I wanted to kind of do what I call the Seinfeld thing, which is like leave at the height. So people are always talking about you, always wanting you. I knew that would drive my business in the future instead of like, just being a burnout. I wanted a complete winning record also. I wanted no one to ever step up and Google me and not find anything but complete top of sales wins. And I knew that that would be my resume for doing this. And that's what I did. And so, the fire I had in my belly for the research and just, coming out of the rubble, it was unbelievable. Because the one thing I will tell you about the other side of the pain is that if you can hold on to the littlest of hope, wherever you find yourself, if you can compartmentalize it, if you can set your pain shoes on the, shelf and pick it up when you need to, the more things you put in place that give you joy, the more broadening and build mindset, which is your happy, the more serotonin you create, the more dopamine you create. So I'm going to tell you something. I work out And I know that creates those two chemicals. And so when my sister passed away, I did not work out for only 3 days. And on the fourth day I went, I'm telling you, I could barely lift a weight. It felt like I had 100-pound weight on me, but I went through the motions. And then it was another 3 days when I was a 6 day, workout person. And it took me 30 days to get back to 3 or 4 workouts. But I was pushing myself into the places that just don't lay down when all I wanted to do was lay down. And so, sometimes you have to crawl. I remember going to Fuse. I had to speak like 8 days after my sister died. And I was a keynote and I died to be a keynote. And there I was, being a keynote. And Corey would go with me to that event, and he doesn't go to the broker events. He's not a mortgage broker. He's a mortgage lender. But he went, my nephew was there, and my nephew is the son of my sister who died. So I wanted to be with him because he was going through it too. And he was running the booth. We all were trying to just put our best foot forward. Um, and I had to tell you, I laid in the hotel bed to the minute that I had to do my keynote. Like I literally pushed myself through getting ready, walked down and walked on stage. And everyone in the audience knew my sister had died because it was all over social media just days before. And before I could even say word one, they went to their feet. I had an opening standing ovation. And it was so emotional for me because I knew it was an outpouring of their love for me to step onto the stage. And I stood and it took me 5 minutes to compose myself to speak. And then I gave one of the best keynotes I've ever delivered. I was calm. Like death makes you put things in context. This market's been hard. My sister died on September 10th, 2022, which is just, 6 months into the downfall of this market. It really gave me a tremendous gift in business because I thought this isn't life or death. Business is not life or death. That doesn't mean I haven't done everything to help businesses and, been focused on all of that stuff. It's just that it gives me context and it still does. I'm traveling more. She's given me so many gifts. I'm traveling more. I have a better work-life balance. I spend more money to have people do work that I didn't like. I stopped doing things I didn't like. I just realized life's too short. My life's not perfect, but you have a story on the other side of the pain. Like if I didn't get past all the places in my pain, I could list 100 incredible things that have happened to me that I would not have experienced that were absolutely mind-blowing. And I know more pain's going to come. At 55 this year, I've got aging parents. I've got, we're going to age. And, I'm going to a funeral today at noon, unfortunately, of a friend's father. It's, and that's happening more. I think I had 6 or 7 friends who lost their parents this year. And so, we're going to walk through pain somewhere in our life and it's going to pick up. It's going to be more rapid. My ability to have these techniques, anyone's abilities to have these techniques of how you come out of pain and all of that is going to be a game changer for their businesses. So as dark as this chapter is, it's a necessary chapter. I think it's helpful. I think it's my professional Bible to, you know, people like me that are strong empaths and their ability to just know that it's like they say, there's a boom coming after the bust. And historically, in everything, business, that's true. That's true in life. Your next greatest thing is coming on the other side of your pain. And so I have now looked up like it's a lighthouse when I'm swimming in the storms of my pain. And I just keep swimming because I know there's something ahead. And I just don't know what it is. I have to put that blind faith and that hope in that. And I really believe that's the way forward.